i's here. You know that I to the 0 is 1, and I to the 1 is I, and I squared is negative 1. Calculate the result for each term up to I to the 15th and describe the pattern. So the best way to do that is just start with the first one and just go on down the list. So I like to start out with the idea that we've been taught that I is equal to the square root of negative 1. We've been taught that last year. Okay, so that's what I is equal to. Okay, so I start making a list. So I have I to the 0. Well, anything to the 0 power is 1. I to the 1 is I, which is the square root of negative 1. I squared is negative 1, and that is because I is the square root of negative 1. So the square root of negative 1 times the square root of negative 1 would make it negative 1. Okay. Hopefully that makes sense. Or maybe it just makes sense that I to the first power is I. I squared is negative 1. I cubed is negative I. And so why is that? So I worked that out over here. I cubed. I cubed, that's I times I times I. So that would be, these two i's make I squared. We said I squared was negative 1. So it's negative 1 times I. So that's negative I. So I actually just worked all these out. Now I to the 4th, well, that's I times I times I times I. So I times I is I squared, and this other I times I, that's another I squared. So I squared times I squared, well, we know that I squared is negative 1. So it's like negative 1 times negative 1, that's 1. And then we're going to see a pattern here. It took me a while, like I had to actually do a little bit of work before I could get my pattern so that I believed the pattern. So I to the 5th, well, I thought of that as I to the 4th times I, so that's just I. I to the 6th, well, you could say I to the 6th is I to the 4th times I squared, right, because they just have to add up to 6. And we know I to the 4th is special because I to the 4th is equal to 1. So I to the 4th times I squared is just I squared, because 1 times anything is itself. And we said I squared was negative 1. So there we go. And you might be able to see the pattern by now. I think I did keep working them out. I noticed once I got past 4, I like I to the 4th so much because I to the 4th is 1. So like I can write I to the 7th as I to the 4th times I cubed. Well, if I to the 4th is 1, I cubed is negative I, then I just get it's a negative I. I to the 8th, well, that would be I to the 4th times I to the 4th. That's 1 times 1, that's equal to 1. And so I won't bore you with all the rest of this, but notice how it goes 1, I, negative 1, negative I. 1, I, negative 1, negative I. 1, I, this will be negative 1, negative I. 1, I, negative 1, negative I. And then I noticed that every time that it's equal to 1, this is a multiple of 4, like, and I know that it's easy for me to understand that because I to the 4th is 1, so this was like 2I to the 4th, so this would be 3I to the 4th. So I to the 4th is kind of a special key to this pattern. So this was the answer to letter A. It said calculate the result for each term, and we did all the way up to 15, and then describe the pattern. So you would want to say the pattern is, it goes 1, I, negative 1, negative I. That's the pattern. And then it repeats 1, I, negative 1, negative I. So write that for your answer. And then for letter B, it says use this pattern to calculate I to the 16th. So I to the 16th, well, we just said that every time I is a multiple of 4, in our list, we just get a bunch of I to the 4th. I to the 4th is 1, so I to the 16th is going to be 1. I don't even have to do any calculations. I already know, because that's a multiple of 4. And then I have to do I to the 20th. Well, I to the 25th. So I like to base all of this on multiples of 4. So what I would do is just I would divide 4 into 25. Like 4 times 6 is 24, and there'd be 1 left over. So in other words, whatever the remainder is, that's what you're going to raise I to. Because you can rewrite this as I to the 6th, I to the 24th time, because that's a multiple of 24, times I. So really, I to the 24th is just 1, so you're just going to be equal to I right here. Okay, so I to the 16th is 1, I to the 25th is I to the 39th. So I even did it down here. I'm gonna like multiply 4 or divide 4 into 39. 4 times 9 is 36. I get a remainder of 3. Whatever the remainder of 3 is, that's what is left over. So in other words, I can say this is I to the 36th times I to the 3rd, right? 36. And so this I know is a multiple of 4 because I did the long division and got it. So this is going to be just 1 and then I cubed. So the answer is I cubed. Oh, well, I cubed is negative I. Okay, so I to the 16th was 1, I to the 25th was I to the 39th was negative I, and then we'll try another one. I to the 100th. Well, 100 is a multiple of 4 because 25 times 4, so I just already know that's 1. It's a little confusing, but they're going to kind of lead us into more answers. So letter C says, what is I to the 4n? And by this time, we should say that we know that it's 1. Because when it's multiples of 4, then you're going to get 1. And then letter D says, based on your answer to part C, simplify I to the 4n plus 1, I to the 4n plus 2, and I to the 4n plus 3. Well, this one's going to like have 1 left over. So this will just be I. This one's just going to be, because the 4n part, that ends up being 1. And then 1 times I squared would be I squared. But I squared, we can say I squared is negative 1. And then this one's going to end up being I cubed. But I cubed is negative I. And if you want to, I've seen kids before like write this little pattern on their notes, on their cheat sheet. You can do that. Okay, and then the very last part, it says calculate I to the 396, I to the 397, I to the 398, and I to the 399. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to see how many times 4 goes in. I'm going to see if that's divisible by 4. And this time I'll just use my calculator. So 396 divided by 4. Okay, so 396 divided by 4, it actually 4 goes into 396 evenly. So I know that this has to be 1. And if this is 1, this is going to have like 1 left over I. So this will just be I. And then see how this is just the next one in the list? It's got that pattern. So there's the I. And then so this one's going to be I squared, but we know that I squared is negative 1. And then this one's going to be I to the cubed, or I to the third, so negative I. Our pattern. And that's it.